Life used to be so simple. We talk about safety more generally, so products just need to be safe, end of. But now we're in a world of products needing to be safe, IoT secure, and sustainable, and also inclusive. It becomes a much more complex landscape. But that is one of the sort of the risks that we need to buy. And the message is clear for consumers, really. Make sure that you buy products from retailers that you know and trust. That'll take you a long way to make sure that they're safe. But behind the scenes, we need to make sure that standards are sort of fit for purpose in that regard, and they really are giving the protection both to legitimate business and also to consumers.
You are listening to the Consumers and Standards series from the BSI Education Podcast in association with CPIN, the Consumer and Public Interest Network. Today's episode is on consumers in a digital world.
The voice you heard at the top of the episode there was Martyn Allen from campaigning charity Electrical Safety First, talking about the 4 S's of safety, security, sustainability and standards as regards the rise of smart products. We'll hear more from Martyn later, and also from other digital technology experts, Liz Coll, Myrstad and Pete Eisenegger. Hello, my name is Matthew Chiles, and you are listening to the 5th episode of the BSI Education Podcast Consumers and Standards series, which is about consumers and the digital world. And we are delighted to be bringing it to you in association with our friends at CPIN, the Independent Consumer and Public Interest Network, which, in 2021, is celebrating its 70th anniversary.
The Consumer and Public Interest Network, or CPIN, empowers and protects consumers, making everyone's life safer, fairer and better through effective consumer representation in British standards. Established in 1951, CPIN's trained volunteers participate in the development of standards to highlight key consumer issues, making sure that real-life problems are addressed and the risk of consumer harm is minimized. CPIN believes that all consumers have a right to safe and accessible goods and services, clear information, fair treatment, effective systems of redress, and a healthy environment. CPIN representatives use the United Nations Guidelines for Consumer Protection as the foundation of their work. They sit on hundreds of standards development committees, speaking up for consumers. To find out more, visit bsigroup.com/consumers.
The consumer voice in standards is incredibly important. This is because standards are everywhere, making consumers' lives safer, fairer and easier. Whether you're using a mobile phone or shopping online, standards behind the scenes are setting good practice for organisations that make goods and provide services. Now, BSI publishes around 3,000 standards every year, and it'd be pretty much impossible for CPIN to get involved in every single one. So instead, resources are focused in areas where CPIN can have the greatest positive impact for consumers, based on 5 priorities: sustainability, consumer vulnerability, consumer safety, digital and services. Now, the aim of the BSI Education Podcast is to bring you the stories behind the standards. So this series looks at some of the stories and issues for each of these 5 priorities. So for this episode, the CPIN priority is digital.
The digital age offers opportunities and benefits for consumers, but the speed of innovation and the complex nature of digital ecosystems also poses the risk of new forms of consumer harm. More and more consumer products include a digital element, from fitness trackers to toys, from smart energy meters to autonomous vehicles. It is increasingly difficult to be an engaged and informed consumer without being connected, as organizations increasingly rely on digital as a primary tool for account management and communication. Consumers, in particular those who are vulnerable, often find it difficult to understand the complexity of digital products and services. It is unrealistic to expect them to take responsibility for avoiding harm. Suppliers need to ensure that their products are well designed, fit for purpose, and safe. CPIN makes sure that the needs of consumers operating in the digital world are considered in the development of all relevant standards.
Here's me with a quick reminder that for more information on BSI education, go to bsigroup.com/education. Do please rate and review us wherever you get your podcasts. And if you like what we do here on the hashtag BSIEdPod and you listen to us via Apple Podcasts, then please consider giving us a 5-star rating. It really does make a difference to us being found via search and recommendations. Share us on social media using that hashtag BSIEdPod. And if you have any comments or questions about this episode or previous episodes, or even ideas for future episodes, then do please get in touch at education@bsigroup.com. We really welcome your feedback. So this episode looks at how CPIN and standards play an important role in improving outcomes for consumers in the digital world, with 4 guests. Finn Myrstad, Director of Digital Policy and Energy at the Norwegian Consumer Council, Martyn Allen, Technical Manager at Electrical Safety First, Pete Eisenegger, CPIN Rep and Standards Maker, and Liz Coll, Consumer Tech and Digital Policy Consultant. Liz has worked in consumer rights and advocacy in the UK and internationally for over 12 years, and is a specialist in the impact of connected digital technology on markets, consumers, and regulation. I spoke to Liz about the general shift towards shopping and accessing services online, some of the associated consumer risks, including those that may have become more apparent or increased because of COVID, and how standards might help to mitigate them. But in classic hashtag BSIEdPod style, I started by asking Liz about her standards journey.
Well, I've always worked in consumer rights and consumer protection. So I started off at Consumer Focus, which was the UK statutory bodies that had particular duties to protect and empower consumers across different markets. And then I went on to work at Citizens Advice, again in similar in consumer policy, campaigns and research. I've always taken a big interest in the digital world and how it's impacting on all of us and all aspects of our lives. And I think I got to know the role of standards through my jobs there. After Citizens Advice, I went and worked at Consumers International, which is a umbrella group for all the consumer groups across the world. So you've got huge ones like Consumer Reports in the States, right down to really tiny 2-person voluntary groups in Argentina. So Consumers International has members across 100 countries, and there's about 200 of them. So it's a really interesting and powerful consumer network. And I think it was there that I really realised the power of standards and how useful they are as an international tool that works across borders, that can, recognised by the WTO, so useful in trade. And also what was really interesting was how useful they were for our consumer organisations who were campaigning for different rules and changes in their countries, in countries where they don't particularly have a mature consumer protection regime, or indeed any consumer protection regime. So there are quite a few countries where there's no Consumer Protection Act, certainly no ministry or active agencies. And the value there for them was that standards could be sort of used instead of them drafting regulation from scratch. So I thought that was really interesting, and particularly for technical standard, that was really helpful. Although immediately you have the question of, are those countries that are using them adequately represented in the standards committees? But I think that's a bigger issue that in terms of development. And at Consumers International, I met people who'd been involved in setting things like the mobile payment standard, energy efficiency standard. So really practical, tangible things that consumer groups were doing alongside industry and policymakers. So I thought it was a really interesting model, not one that I'd known huge amounts about. So I had standards were sort of on the back burner while I carried on with the digital work I was doing there. But since becoming an independent consultant, I've worked in standards a bit more. And at the moment, I'm working with ANEC, who are the European group for who represent consumers within the EU setup of standards committees. And I'm sitting as the representative on JTC 21 on artificial intelligence.
We love our acronyms of the standards world, don't we? We love our acronyms.
So I'm getting quite good at it all now. So JTC 21 AI, which is the body, which is a committee that's been set up to develop the standards which will be delivering and implementing the artificial intelligence proposed regulation. So that's a really, really big deal, a very challenging area. It's pretty difficult for standards, I think, because they're using technical product standards for a technology that's actually not yet fully understood, and where values and ethics are playing quite a big part in how it's rolled out. But yeah, so that's I've started that this year, and so I'm now for the first time actually sitting within the committees and seeing firsthand how the negotiations and inputs all work. I've also this year have became part of CPIN steering group. This is really bringing a more strategic view and advice to the activities of CPIN. And I think my experience internationally, but also working on digital, and I've done quite a lot of research and insight pieces into what's coming next. So what's around the corner for consumers and for the world. And I think that's something that that CPIN liked and so invited me to help be part of their steering group.
Now, Liz, with this I think it's fair to say we have had a general shift here towards shopping and using services online. That's the general direction of travel. I suppose what I'm interested first is to find out what you think is the potential for consumer harm because of that general move towards, as I say, to move towards shopping and using those services online.
Well, I mean, first of all, I'm not anti-technology and things like that. I really love it, and I'm really into it, and I think it's fascinating the way that it's changing things. But some of the changes are not great. But I think what's interesting are the things that make the digital services and the digital transition so convenient, so quick, so fun in many ways to use, are also the things that are causing the problem. So what I mean by that is, when you have services where where it's not clear exactly who's delivering it, so maybe Deliveroo or on Amazon, you've got a one-stop shop where you can get things really quickly, but you're not quite clear what's going on behind the scenes. And generally that's okay. I mean, people don't face, people can do a lot of shopping and not face many problems. But if things go wrong, it can be really problematic. A lot of that comes from not knowing who's responsible for different bits of the journey, or how you might get in touch with somebody to get it put right, or who's really behind delivering the services. So I know some consumer groups recently did a sweep of products on online platforms. So that's where there's an intermediary, which is selling between producers and to consumers. And they found they took a selection of electrical goods, and 66% of them were deemed unsafe, so they didn't meet European safety standards. Now, if you were shopping on one of those platforms and buying a new charger or a hairdryer, whatever, you would probably quite reasonably assume that it was being sold to you and it would be meeting like your national or regional safety regulations. But that's not the case, and I think that's where there's the type of harms that can occur when people are assuming things are safe because they look safe and that's what you're used to. But what you're actually getting isn't meeting all of those background checks and things that you'd expect. So that's one way in which I think there's real potential for harm. I think also there's this sense of not always knowing what's exactly real online. So this comes across in, obviously, people would talk a lot about this with social media or with fake news and the impact that has on people's mental health or on political systems, etc. When you're a consumer, I suppose it's more things like, is this review real, or is this product as it's described? So and things like that. And it's really difficult for people to be able to sometimes pick apart what's real and what's not, and that can then affect the products you buy, whether you buy something that's low standard and lose your money, or you can't return it, etc. And I think the other thing that this is a sort of personal bugbear of mine is this just not being able to access people or a human to get things put right. So I think that's a huge one for some of the harms people can face when things do go wrong. It's often pretty difficult to find the right person or any person to talk to get it put right.
I absolutely hear you. I know I do try and take advantage of the chat functions, but often with those, you have 3 or 4 layers of bot to get through before you say, do you want to speak to a human? Yes, I would like to speak to a human, please, which is what I wanted in the first place. So that's really, really frustrating, isn't it? I think everyone would be with you on that. I just wonder, Liz, we've all lived through COVID over the past the 18 months or so. And I just wonder sort of to what extent COVID has had an impact on these potential harms and vulnerabilities, towards this general shift towards shopping and using services online. What's been the impact of COVID, you think?
I mean, it certainly increased people's reliance on online services, from groceries to, video calling your families or for work. Lots of people used online grocery shopping for the first time, and then existing users up their growth as well. And it's obviously driven people online. And I suppose it's whether that was always done by choice or by necessity. I mean, either way, it was fantastic it was there, and it enabled services to get to people in good time, and enabled people to connect. I think what's quite interesting is it's come at a time when there's been quite a big increase in scrutiny from regulators, journalists, charities and campaigners on the way that large tech companies work, how they, for example, treat our data, how they target us, how they tend to dominate markets and not leave you with many other places to go. I mean, it's quite hard sometimes to buy something that's not on Amazon if you're looking for just a kind of simple purchase. So at the same time that we're really relying heavily, or having to rely really heavily on digital, consumers are waking up to some of the downsides, like fake reviews, or you just mentioned, not really being able to get hold of anyone and speaking to a robot, and also regulation and it's coming from all different areas. So I think that it's going off your question a bit, but I think it's COVID. There's one narrative, which is that, everything's gone so digital, we're never going back. And it's jumped ahead. And I certainly think that, it has really consolidated its impact on people. On the other hand, with that becomes the biggest levels of scrutiny we've seen, which have been growing for a long time and are now becoming quite mainstream. So I think that's quite an interesting thing to watch. In terms of more specifics, it's really some of the things I mentioned before. So we saw a big rise in fake medicines, low quality personal protective equipment, all of that grew a lot during the pandemic. The union Unite, I don't know if you've heard, they investigated items like toilet roll and face masks and hand wash on Amazon, and found that most of them, they said, at least were there for at least double their usual price between March and July, when the first lockdown was in effect. So that was on Amazon. So that's price gouging. Now, we've probably all heard of price gouging, but when it happens at that scale, and when you're in a crisis and when you really, really need these things, that kind of stuff can happen. And the only time they're taken down is when people like Unite or people go and report it to a large platform like Amazon. So again, it goes back to what I was saying before. There isn't that behind the scenes check to make sure that things are okay for consumers. But I think we need to remember that, for some people and, for a lot of us, it's been really good. If you like and you had time to watch lots of movies and content, then, you're going to be really valuing those digital services. If you like doing your banking only online and never having to queue up, you're going to be really enjoying and valuing the fact that these things are online. As much as you value that, things can still go wrong. So there's a good example I heard today about digital-only banks who have offered a great service, really popular, really innovative, really quick, and people have really enjoyed and valued using them over the traditional bank. But there's been quite a few cases of consumers being shut out of their bank accounts just being frozen with no explanation. And they think that the reason for this is that an algorithm, an AI algorithm, is interpreting the banking regulations on suspicious activity on your account a bit too strongly. And so whereas in the old days, you may have had a call from someone at your bank to say, look, we've seen this transaction. Is that you? Is that fine? And the problem would be sorted. when you've only got the digital technologies behind the scenes making those decisions, they can be really blunt. People are frozen out of their accounts, not able to access their cash. So I just always would put the caution that, yes, there's loads of great stuff within the digital transition and digital revolution, but we shouldn't lose sight of the fact that things can go wrong quite quickly. And it's going to be really useful if those things can be thought about before the services are developed or as they're developed. And again, that's where standards could really help to think through how you might deal with situations that come up like that.
Obviously, we have over the last 10, 15 years, there's been this general shift towards shopping and using services online. COVID has sort of accelerated that change, hasn't it? Because we had to do more online. I just wonder, because of that quick acceleration, has that made things particularly challenging for consumers?
I think it would depend. It depends where you were before. So I think if you were one of those people, maybe having to bank online for the first time or doing your grocery shopping for the first time, it's likely that you would maybe be slightly older or in a lower income bracket. So that just stepping into the digital consumer world could have been difficult, and particularly at a time when things were very stressful. So I think it really depends on who you are. I mean, for others, it would have been less of a shift, even perhaps a welcome shift. So it's, I think, if you like watching movies and had a lot of downtime to be spending doing that, then I think it would be fine. But I think it really does depend. I mean, I think it definitely shone a light on people who didn't have digital access, who, sort of anti-poverty charities were well aware of how much more you pay as a consumer if you're not online. So research, I think by the Resolution Foundation and places like Citizens Advice have always been really aware of how expensive it is not to be getting the direct debit deals or those particular online deals. You just end up spending more. So the people with the least end up spending more. And I think that then probably became a lot more apparent to people if you're having to do things online or spend a lot more time online. So if you don't have your great, fixed contract with your mobile, but you're relying on data and pay as you go, then those things, take a big slice out of your budget. So I think those harms really possibly became a lot more apparent as people had to become more reliant on digital.
And in terms of the role of standards then, what role do they play in helping to mitigate some of these risks that you've talked about for consumers?
I think standards are really helpful. But I mean, going back to what I said right at the beginning, I think it's completely fair enough that consumers just expect things to be done in a certain way, because so they expect reviews to be genuine, they would expect safety checks to happen, and they would expect problems to be sorted and things to be going on behind the scenes. I think what standards really do is then make that real. So where those things aren't happening, they provide a framework for saying, look, this is how you can do it in a digital environment. So we're seeing some standards which are dealing with new problems. So the online review standard it is talking very much about how the process that you would go through to have verified, authenticated and genuine reviews on your site, and how you would check for that, how you would take down ones that were not genuine, what would be a fair way to weight and rate them, etc. So that's dealing with a new specific. And then there were other standards which deal with things which have been around for a long time and cause problems. So terms and conditions being a really good example of that. So we're all aware that the small print has been an issue for decades, but it used to be something that you probably only were aware of or worried about when you were buying insurance or, taking out car hire or something. Now suddenly you're engaging in numerous terms and conditions every day, absolutely really long, really complicated, really difficult to use, but you're entering into those contracts as a consumer in the digital world all the time. So the standards that BSI have proposed and which has now been accepted by ISO into standardising terms and conditions for clarity and to make sure that they're easy for people, that can help put that trust back, because at the moment, no one's reading them and there could be anything in there. So I think that standardizing, and of course, encouraging companies and businesses to use those standards, and that they are the thing that will help drive trust. It's going to really help consumers.
And I suppose as someone who has worked in this field for a long time now, what do you see as the value of CPIN?
I think CPIN's quite unique in the way that it's formalised consumer representation into the standards body. So having now worked in Europe, there's hardly any countries which have that model in their standards development organisations. So to have this network which is actively feeding in consumer angles and perspectives and wants right at the point when standards are developed, it's something I think we should really celebrate and really encourage in other national bodies.
Did you know? Information overload.
Recent research from the consumer organisation Which found that typical terms and conditions for online shopping and social media sites are harder to understand than Stephen Hawking's A Brief History of Time. And yet, the average time to accept T's and C's online is just 8 seconds. Now, earlier, Liz Coll talked about some of the consumer risks and benefits as we move towards buying more products and accessing more services online. But as the vast majority of us make that shift, what about the issue of consumer data collected by companies and organisations? I picked up the issue of the what, how, why and when of consumer data collection, including the use of digital twins, with Finn Myrstad. Finn is Director of Digital Policy and Energy at the Norwegian Consumer Council, where he leads the development of ethical digital policies in an attempt to convince governments and companies to improve their policies. So Finn, what's been your standards journey? Where did it start for you and where are you now?
Thank you. Thank you for inviting me as well. Well, I've been working previous to this job, I was working in Brussels, working on environmental protection standards. So working on emission standards and reducing NOx emissions in particular. So working for a company that was providing solutions on how to reduce NOx. So that was really interesting to see how the European Union with its rulemaking abilities could create standards that would be across Europe and have impact for millions of people and the environment as well. But recently, the last 8 years, I've been working at the Norwegian Consumer Council, where we have been working on exposing how companies are not following the expected standards of their services. So that could be consumers obviously expect that their data will be protected when they use a digital service. They expect companies to abide by what they believe is the rules. And I think our research has shown that companies are sadly very often not following the expected standards, whether that is in relation to basic consumer rights online or data protection, privacy, or security even. So we've done lots of research into terms and conditions and privacy and security, and obviously pushing for better standards and better rules in this area.
Now, you mentioned there about consumer expectation, and obviously this episode is around the digital world. So how and when is consumer data collected when we shop and access services online?
It's collected more and more all the time. It could be collected from your smartwatch. It's often collected through your apps on your phone. And what people don't think about and are not aware of, and I was certainly not aware of this before I started working in this field, is that one thing is the sort of data you input yourself. So, it could be your photo on Instagram or Facebook or TikTok. But also our research and other people's research has shown that these apps are also extraordinarily hungry, and they collect data passively from your phone. So that could be collecting your location data in the background. It could be harvesting your contact lists. It could be sending unique identifiers from your phone to marketers. And what we see is that this data is then passed on to hundreds, potentially thousands of commercial actors who are trading in our data. And this also happens when you visit a website, for example. Companies can place cookies, small pieces of software on your computer, and then will collect information about the website you visit, where your mouse is hovering, whether you buy something or not, etc. And this is also often combined with other types of data that companies are collecting about you. That could be purchase history, that could be publicly available information, combined with sort of comparing your digital profile with people that look like you, so that companies can make predictions about your future behavior. And obviously, all of this happens generally without anyone's knowledge, and also without really anyone being able to control this in a meaningful way.
It's interesting you say that, because I was going to ask you, how aware do you think consumers are of how this personal data is collected and used, and how aware are they how it could affect other parts of their lives?
I think people. I think when I speak to people, people are aware that something's happening, right? You could be searching for shoes or traveling after COVID. Hopefully, you can travel again, and you're searching for a trip to Barcelona or somewhere, and you suddenly see an ad for the product or service you just searched for. And I think people are aware that things are happening. I don't think people are aware of the extent of the data collection, and I don't think people are aware of all the potential consequences this data collection could have. But I must also say, awareness is really, really important. But this is maybe one of those fields where consumers cannot fix this by themselves, because the data collection is happening sort of invisibly, and you can't really open the hood of an app and look inside and see, where's my data going? I want to stop it. And there are no real meaningful controls in the apps, generally speaking, on the phones, generally speaking, to make you empowered to stop this kind of tracking. It is possible to reduce it, but it's quite impossible to completely reduce the kind of data collection that I just described.
Can you give us any sort of concrete examples of what businesses do with this information they're gathering?
So the typical primary use is to serve us ads. So they collect this data and they make rich digital profiles. We call them digital twins, for example. So that means that there's a Matthew profile, a profile of you in many, many companies. They will then bid on, whenever you visit an app or a website, they will bid on showing you an ad. And depending on your profile, they will be thinking, oh, you're maybe an attractive consumer in certain areas, and they will show you an ad that they think will influence you to do a purchase, for example. But it could also be the other way around, so that they say, hey, Matthew, he's a bit of a risk taker. He does this and this on his spare time. We're not going to target ads for health insurance to this guy because I think he's going to be a liability for us. And in effect, you're being discriminated because you're not receiving offers, for example, for health insurance or mortgages or potentially even jobs. We have examples in the US where it's been uncovered that minorities, for example, have not been shown ads for certain types of jobs. Women have been excluded from job ads. Housing ads are only shown to white people in certain areas, etc., etc. So these profiles are made to influence us, and the basic use is to show us ads, but the wider consequences can be much, much wider.
What are those risks? I mean, you mentioned there about advertisements for jobs. I think Facebook there was a controversial issue with Facebook last week around putting particular advertisements in front of certain people. But what are the additional risks then about with companies using this data to influence our consumer choice and decision making?
Well, one of the things that we're really afraid of is the ability to manipulate people, because when you collect data, I mean, you could say that data from one app is not very revealing, but when you look at all the pieces of the puzzle combined, so all your digital activities from when you wake up in the morning until you go to bed, and you compare it to people that look like you, it's really easy to discover your weaknesses. And I can, for example, use myself as an example. So there are probably many digital twins of me out there. And let's say you're working for a gambling company, and you see that a lot of our customers have a similar profile to Finn. They have these interests, and they're spending a lot of money on our service. But they realize, but Finn is not a customer. They won't know my name, but there will be an ID connected to my profile. So we want to reach Finn and people that look like him, but who are not yet customers. And let's trigger his gambling addiction, because I can see that with 98% probability, people like Finn have a latent gambling problem. So they can then target me with very specific ads, me and maybe hundreds of thousands of people that have a similar profile to me, and give me offers that I cannot refuse. So that could be giving me £100 to gamble and then get me hooked. And this way, when you can identify people's vulnerabilities, whether it is gambling or alcohol, or it is anything else really, or the fact that you're not very price sensitive, you can target all kinds of products and services to you when you are at your most vulnerable. And now that when it is possible to monitor people's sleep and people's habit, you can basically predict people's moods, whether you're depressed or whether you're happy. It is possible to target these messages or these ads towards you when you are at your most vulnerable. And we are afraid, with artificial intelligence and machine learning, that the capabilities of manipulating consumers will be just growing. And our natural defenses are basically being worn down when you can target people based on their vulnerabilities. In the old days, you could see maybe a commercial and it would be obvious to you that it is a commercial. It's an advertisement in a magazine. And you could sort of put up your natural defense and say, hey, this is an advertisement. Okay, I can choose to take this information on board and make a purchase, but I can also choose not to. But with everything sort of micro-targeted, it is becoming increasingly difficult.
I just wonder how, I mean, in many respects, what you described there is quite terrifying. In a sense, we are being constantly monitored and watched without and us providing data without us realizing it. I just wonder how much of a growing issue this is. I mean, is this accelerated particularly over the last 2 or 3 years? I mean, when was the genesis of this? And I suppose, where are we now, do you think, in the growth of this data collection?
I think this has been going on for to a lesser or larger extent for about 10, 15 years. But obviously, with the emergence of the smartphone, which is in our pocket, super advanced computers, basically, that can, easily decide whether you're walking or biking or in a car. It can determine what floor you're in a building. It's sending out constant signals to other machines. So the surveillance capabilities have increased a lot. And we've seen also the business models that are involved in this are growing a lot. So, you have the Facebooks and the Googles, of course, but you also have thousands of other companies involved in this. And also with more devices connected to our bodies, making it possible to monitor our every move and every breath, really. This has become a huge industry. We've had several reports where we sort of went in and hacked apps, looked at the data flows. We've uncovered where the data goes. We filed a legal complaint last year against a dating app called Grindr, where we exposed that the app was sharing, in our view, people's sexual orientation with marketers, in addition to sharing their location data. And all this can be, of course, misused. And I talked about discrimination, obviously one area, manipulation another. But when it comes to issues such as religion or political orientation or sexual orientation, it can have real life consequences. And just earlier this year, it was a Catholic priest in the US lost his job because it was exposed that he was using the Grindr app, and obviously then not living in accordance to the rules of the church. So it was used to basically out him as potentially gay, and he lost his job and his life was in ruins. So, when data is being misused as well, that is a real threat towards consumers.
Just switching back to the collection there, you mentioned the data collection, you mentioned a sort of surveillance. And I know that as the Norwegian Consumer Council, you've done a couple of reports into smart devices, and particularly around the issues of children. Can you tell us about those?
Yeah, so a few years ago, we decided to see the state of affairs on children's issues. And we looked into some smart toys targeted at children. And our expectation was that at least children would have better protections because they have, by law, better protections. And obviously, it's quite clear that children are a vulnerable group, children, youth. So we looked at a few smart toys, so internet-connected toys, and we looked at some smart watches, internet-connected watches, basically working as mobile phones for children on their wrists. And what we uncovered was, at least in the smart toy example, widespread data sharing of children's data, but also large security vulnerabilities, making it possible for people to hack these toys and possibly communicate with the children. And also with the smartwatches, with some of the watches we looked at, there were massive security problems. And this basically highlighted the fact that we're completely sort of at the beginning of developing good standards for security, ICT security or cyber security in Europe and the world. And we basically saw that there are very few common standards being applied by the industry here. So that's an area where we really hope that rules and standards will improve in the years to come, because with everything being connected online, it will make consumers very vulnerable to misuse and abuse if we don't get this right soon.
I suppose that's the heart of the issue, actually. That's what I want to ask you that question. How can standards help protect consumers in terms of the collection and misuse of their data?
I think there's I'm not a standards expert, but I think there's you need to have some legal standards so that you can hold companies accountable, and I think you need some more practical standards that can instruct companies on how to do things right. Because I think in many cases it's not evil intent by companies when they have poor security; they just don't know how to do it right. So I think that standards can go above and beyond the minimum standards of the law, for example. And I think that's where they could play a good role. In security, in particular in security, I think there is a much more joint interest in doing it right. In the privacy area, there is maybe sometimes conflicting interest, because there will be an interest of companies to collect as much data as possible, whereas in the interest of the consumer, it might be that less data is collected. But in the security field, I have the feeling that almost everyone wants security to be better. And also, I think that would be very good for society, because it will create economies of scale. You would have companies being able to deliver security services to other companies. So if you manage to build good standards around ICT security, I think it would be a benefit for everyone. Because these consumer devices, just to give you one example, are being used in massive hacks against governments, for example. You can direct printers, for example, to take down government websites. So there's a clear link between the consumer field and also national security here.
I think, you mentioned there about the relationship really between the law and obviously and the sort of legal framework in order to protect consumers from harm, and then standards in order to develop good practice in the sector, and obviously they need to work in harmony. I just wonder, you've set out some of the issues here that we're all facing. I just wonder, from a standards perspective again, if we were trying to bite off a particular part of the cake here, where are standards you think required more immediately in this particular area in terms of either collection or use of consumer data?
I think ICT security obviously is an area where I think it would be very useful. I think within privacy and data protection, I think standards could be helpful in in some sort of you have, without getting into all the specifics, you have principles in the GDPR, like the data protection framework we have in Europe, where you have, for example, data minimization as a principle. And maybe there could be standards developed that can help companies implement that better. What does it mean in practice? What is security by design? What is privacy by design? What are good practices in this area? And you can go from area to area and develop good standards for companies to implement and service providers to implement. I think that probably could be very helpful. But I do think it's really important when you create these standards that they don't become the lowest common denominator, and as a result creates more loopholes or basically makes companies go not longer than they intended to do. So I think it's important that standards are transparent, they have consumer participation, and that they're not co-opted by only industry interests.
Now, towards the end of my conversation with Finn, we spoke about smart toys and watches for children. And it's on the subject of standards and smart products that I spoke to Martyn Allen, Technical Manager at Electrical Safety First, who we heard from at the top of the episode. Martyn represents consumer safety interests on a range of British, European and international standards committees. Before we talked about what is meant by smart products, Martyn told me about how standards have become such an important part of his working life.
Well, really, from leaving school, I started my working life as an underground electrician when we had a coal industry, and that's clearly a safety critical environment. And so, safety was drilled into me at a very early stage. The need to follow rules as I thought they were then. It's really as standards and also legislation. And then, from there, I went into the engineering sector of the insurance industry. So I was carrying out inspections on large electrical equipment for insurance purposes and also for legislation purposes, and also doing lots of wiring installation inspections in mines, quarries, petrochemical sites, banks, supermarkets, a whole raft of locations. And that was all to standards. So my interest in standards and safety primarily was sort of embedded in me from a really early stage. And from that side, then I sort of joined Electrical Safety Council, as it was called then, 15 years ago. And, as technical director, then, my responsibility and my passion really to make sure that we do sort of make sure consumers are protected. And that's from the products they're buying. So again, making sure that standards are indeed fit for purpose to match the products. And also from the installation side as well, continue that interest. From a charity, we look at installations as well as products. So we use standards on a day-to-day basis to sort of support our product investigations. So we'll pick on various things to look at, whether it's mobile phone chargers or kitchen equipment, health and beauty, and we sort of screen those against standards. Primarily because we think there may be a gap, and we'll test that out as part of that investigation. And then if that is indeed proven to be true, then we'll use that evidence to take back to the standards committees to improve that standard from a safety purpose. So standards are really critical to the work we do in our organisation because they provide that evidence base. The challenge we have, and many of people listening in all have the same appreciation, no doubt, is that standards, there are lots and lots of them, and it's hard to keep pace. The speed of innovation that we keep seeing now is sort of really difficult and challenging to make sure that standards are up there and providing the necessary protections. We've seen connected products that we'll sort of talk about shortly. We've seen sustainability, including right to repair. There's sort of moves around making sure standards are more inclusive. So all that work to feed into the standards development work is just really, really challenging. But, we are committed to make sure that consumer representation in those standards from an electrical perspective is indeed there. That's one of the main things that we do as an organisation and personal passion from my side.
Now, you mentioned there about the fast pace of technology, and I want to ask you about that because one of the sort of changes that we've seen in terms of products over the last 10 or 15 years has been the rise of smart products. So what do we mean by smart products and how prevalent are they becoming in our lives?
Yeah, I mean, everything seems to be smart nowadays, doesn't it? We've got smart meters, smartphones, smart watches, smart TVs, but increasingly we're seeing more and more normal domestic appliances becoming increasingly connectable. And I say connectable because they've got a smart capability, but many connected products at the moment are not actually connected. I'll use myself as an example. I have one of these sort of large American-style fridge freezers, and it's got connectability. But I haven't chose to connect it because I'm not seeing the purpose. However, other products that we see now being developed, that their connectability is actually providing a real safety benefit, and I'll get into that in a short while. But other smart products that we see and people will probably sort of appreciate and have in their homes will be the rise of the voice assistant. So the Amazon's Alexa, the Google Home, Apple Siri. So these voice assistants are becoming more and more prevalent. And initially they were a bit of a gimmick, and you could ask Alexa what the weather's going to be like or where the nearest pizza restaurant is and so on. But we can now use those devices to connect with products. So you can ask Alexa to switch the lights on or to control the temperature. Some of these are for convenience issues, but we need to make sure safety is part of this journey as well. And from the connected sort of product evolution, from my side of things, I'm really finding of interest some of the challenges that we've had in product safety around product registration, product recalls, to intervene when things go wrong. Connectability, digital products actually sort some of those problems out. If you can connect it, you can interact with it in many cases. And I suppose the obvious example of that would be the Samsung Note 7 issue that was a few years ago. They had some design flaws with the battery and they needed to recall those products. And because they were connected, Samsung were able to interact with their consumers who had those affected products. They were initially sending text messages to say, there's a problem, take it back to the retail, and they'll sort of replace it for you. They took further action because not everybody sort of chose to do that because they love their phone, So they were able then to change the characteristics of the phone to reduce the charging capacity, to put less stress on the battery that was the origin of the problem and causing those fires. And ultimately, for those consumers who still didn't sort of take any action, they could switch the phones off. So a real success story in sort of a manufacturer taking sensible steps, but really to sort out a serious safety issue. And so all these connected products that we're starting to see, and we'll see more of in the next few years, as well as making life more convenient, which is probably the reason why most people buy them, but they have huge safety benefits. Some of these products have got the capability to sort of self-monitor. So when the operation is going out of tolerance, whether it's a motor bearing that's failing leading to overheating, whether it's a poor connection or something else, then the machine can change its characteristics and ultimately switch off. Or it could send an alert to the consumer via by their phone or their tablet. All these benefits are just protecting people in their homes, either unwittingly or by involving you through your phone, for example. So some real safety benefits. And the last thing on that side is sort of from people being able to stay in their homes so much longer. Vulnerable people, older people, instead of going into care, connected technology can sort of monitor their whereabouts to make sure they're safe in that environment. You can interact with them, talk to them, and all of that. So, some real sort of powerful safety benefits from connected technology.
You mentioned there some of those benefits, and there's the rise of the smart products and that connectivity. I just wonder, for the other side, sort of flipping on its head, any sort of actual and potential risk for consumers of sort of rise of smart products and connectivity?
Yeah, I mean, there are several that spring to mind, and one of them is linked to the net zero agenda, which is on the news on almost a daily basis. And there's something that's called sort of demand-side response, and ultimately that's trying to take advantage of cheaper tariffs, when things are sort of cheaper to use. And products themselves are then either able to do it themselves because they think they know best, or the consumer might initiate the decision. But products being used at different times of the day, so they may be used at night or when people are out of the house to take advantage of cheaper running costs, which is understandable. And energy bills seem to be going through the roof on a daily basis. So whilst I'm not saying that connected technology being used at those times of the day is going to lead to more fires, but it could impact on higher numbers of people being seriously injured or worse, because if you're asleep, then clearly you're less able to react or even be alerted in that regard. So it's essential that we make sure that the products are as safe as they can be. Standards adapt to that we include the use of more technology to monitor any sort of events that may lead to an unsafe situation. And the rest is left to sort of promoting education of consumers, because for many, many years, self included, we've said don't use these things at night or when you get out of the house. And clearly connected technology, is likely to totally go against that. And we will see things being used more at night. The other sort of potential risk for consumers is interoperability, the race to market, and lots of actors coming into this space. And not just the large brands that we would know, but there's many, many products now entering the market of the cheaper variety that have got connectability. And so it's imperative that we have these products being able to interoperate correctly. And it's not just so it doesn't work and it becomes more of a frustration and you think you've wasted your money. But if interoperability is not correct, then you could find that a safety reliance isn't there, and we could again lead to sort of an unsafe situation. If one product is relying on another, or it's interacting with something the way it shouldn't, then we could have safety issues that come come to the fore, whether it's disabling a protection device or some other reason, then that's something we need to make sure we get right. And again, it's the speed of innovation that sort of impacts on that. So we need to make sure standards and enforcement, not just the standards themselves, are indeed in place, so we don't sort of get into that space. And the other obvious one is around, hacking into products. And I don't just mean so that they can hack into the product to steal your sort of personal details from a privacy point of view, but hacking can lead to safety issues as well, to disable safety features. We've seen that in a few examples. An automatic sort of door locking system that you could sort of interact with your phone. But we've seen some example where somebody's been able to hack into that system and unlock every product that was connected to the cloud system. And there are other examples. Most of them are hypothetical, but there are real use cases now that are coming to the floor. And so we need to make sure that products are as secure as they can be. Before, life used to be so simple. We talk about safety more generally, so products just need to be safe, end of. But now we're in a world of products needing to be safe, IoT secure, and sustainable, and also inclusive. It becomes a much more complex landscape. But that is one of the sort of the risks that we need to buy. And the message is clear for consumers, really. Make sure that you buy products from retailers that you know and trust. That'll take you a long way to make sure that they are safe. But behind the scenes, we need to make sure that standards are sort of fit for purpose in that regard, and they really are giving the protection both to legitimate business and also to consumers.
I like your three S's there. We've got safe, secure, and sustainable, and then you brought in the fourth one, which is standards. So, in terms of standards, then what role do standards play, or will they be playing in the design and development of these smart products and connected devices?
I mean, standards have provided that sort of benchmark, that level playing field for many, many years, to get really new entrants into that space where they can have confidence that they're putting products on the market that are indeed safe and compliant. And it'd be the same in the digital space. I mentioned before about, the speed of innovation. It makes standards development more challenging. So we need a more flexible approach to standards development. But also, the thing for me is standards, certainly in the digital world, is we need standards to focus more on design, do more upfront, to look at the safety aspect, at the inclusive aspect, at the sustainability even, and also the digital IoT security upfront. Do as much as you can in design, because that lessens the chance of something going wrong further down and shortening the life cycle unnecessarily. We need standards that are able to support products from cradle to grave. And my sort of view is that when we look at standards at the moment, and we've got different pieces of legislation that sort of control the policy aspects, both from sustainability, from sort of IoT security and traditional safety. But and standards are falling off that. We've got the low voltage directive for electrical equipment, then we've got the radio equipment directive, and then regulations as you get back into the UK. And all these things need different sort of standards. And what I'm looking at with a digital product, it's like a fridge freezer is a fridge freezer. But if it's a fridge freezer connectability, then it covers two pieces of legislation. And we need to make sure that standards are coping with both sides. We're covering the traditional safety, we're covering the issues to do with IoT security and also sustainability and the other things that I mentioned. And there's arguably an exercise that's needed, and we're sort of looking into this, to do a gap analysis of what standards are actually covering, and see where we can bridge any gaps that exist. Arguably the need for horizontal standards that are going to address those issues, and then we can deal with the sort of vertical standards thereafter. But standards play a real important part to provide that sort of that starting point, that level playing field, and that sort of ability to get new entrants into the space. But they also provide, of course, that checklist for enforcement authorities. If there is a reported safety issue, they rely heavily on a standard to see, well, I've got this product, I'm checking against the standard requirements. And if they don't match, then clearly there's an issue, and they can sort of use that to take action against that particular manufacturer. When we don't have a standard, of course, then it presents more challenges. The only other way to look at it then is to go back to the manufacturer in question and say, you need to prove to me that your product is indeed safe. And the example I would give for that is when we saw hoverboards as they started to flood the market a couple of years ago. And, there was no standard for a hoverboard at that time. In fact, it's still not over the line yet. But in the race to sort the problem out, because we were seeing fires from those things, then in the absence of a standard, the authorities were obliged to go to the manufacturers and say, you need to prove to me that your product is indeed safe. And that's the way to deal with it. But yeah, coming back to the role of standards, it's that they play a vital part and will continue to do so. The challenge for me and others in this space is that we need to make sure that we think more broadly on making sure that we cope with the speed of innovation, because I think it's a different place now than it was 10, 15 years ago.
I've got to pick up on, Martyn, you just said the word hoverboard. So is that coming? Will my children be commuting to school on hoverboards in the future?
Yeah, good question. I mean, hoverboards a couple of 3 years ago were arguably, an advertising sort of issue, really, because they didn't really hover. They were just a fancy roller skate, I suppose. But yeah, there are some videos that you can see online of real hoverboards, and I'm sure in the future we will. I'm always open-minded. Every day, some new innovation has sort of been thrown at me. Somebody will send me a link, and it's like, wow, can they really do that? So I'm sure it will come. And how we set the standards up for true hoverboards, crikey, the speed, the height they'll be allowed to hover, who knows? But it'll be interesting times ahead for sure.
As a final thought, Martyn, obviously you work for a campaigning charity in the issue of electrical safety. I just wonder how important are standards for you in the work that you do, arguing for consumers?
Yeah, we use standards a lot as part of our product investigations that we carry out, but we normally using them as we believe they may be weak in some regard. So we do the testing to confirm that there is a weakness, and then we'll push for change in the standards committee. So we and other consumer representatives try to work together to push for change. Not always easy if you don't have the evidence behind it. Our sort of use of standards is really one of pushing the boundary to say that the standard is perhaps a little behind the times. We'll go and test that out. We'll even include things around foreseeable use that may, again, not be covered in the standard, and we'll test certain scenarios out and then say go and table that, because it's much easier to be heard if you've got the evidence to back that up. If you just raise a view on a potential issue, then it's almost closed the door on your way out. But if you've got solid evidence, it's more difficult to dismiss that.
I suppose that's the beauty of it too, as well, because obviously the standard could be set at a particular level or a particular agreement on what good looks like in that particular area, but there's a chance then to revise and review that standard as life moves on and as new products enter the market and as the market changes. Absolutely,
and the example I would use is we've seen the rise of electric vehicles, and when they were first coming out, then it's probably Nissan were leading the charge of their Nissan Leaf, and it's like, okay, well, how am I going to charge that up? I'll just plug it into my standard UK socket. 13 amps is going to be great, and but they're not really designed to carry sort of maximum 13 amps.
It takes about 13 hours, doesn't it, for using one of those?
Exactly, and we did some tests in that space and found out that whilst some of the higher quality type plugs and sockets can cope with 13 amps for continued use, some others perhaps were struggling in that space. So, we again did some investigations and found it's probably not a good idea to use your standard plug and socket arrangement to charge your vehicle. And, it's almost seen as an emergency measure now, a bit like your space-saving wheel if you have a puncture on your car, So whilst we're saying it's not unsafe, but it's perhaps not a great idea to use that facility for long periods of time. That information that we found, then we fed back in the standards world, and that sort of reflects that situation now. And also just general messaging from the EV manufacturers as well.
So what does it mean then for Electrical Safety First to be part of CPIN?
Yeah, we've been part of CPIN for a number of years, and we're really pleased and proud to be part of that. We bring electrical safety expertise to that floor, and to work with like-minded consumers, to be able to formulate our arguments and our positions, so we can go to market, go to standards committees with a combined collective voice. It is great, but we don't just sort of provide that information so CPIN, whoever the representative is, to go to the table. We also go to some of those standards committees as well to put the electrical safety first view on that. It gives more weight to the argument, really, just strengthens the whole position that we want to get across. But it's great to see that consumer movement working together. There's nothing worse than duplication. And so, where we can align, it's great. And, we're proud and pleased to provide that electrical safety expertise that we've been doing for a number of years now.
Did you know digital isn't necessarily everywhere?
The internet has improved consumers' access to a huge new range of goods and services. However, campaigning organisation Keep Me Posted has found that some 5.2 million UK households don't have internet access. So relying on online methods of communication only runs the risk of excluding these consumers. We complete our look at the consumer and digital world with Pete Eisenegger. Pete is currently leading the CPIN work on the ISO Consumer Policy Committee on Privacy by Design. Most of Pete's career has been in the area of digital technology, starting with the design and testing of integrated circuits, through system development, to field service operations, to product management, and innovation in products and services. And he has extensive experience in European and international standards making through BSI, CEN and ISO. I spoke to Pete about some of the history of CPIN's work on digital, some of the current challenges for consumer representation in standards development in dealing with the fast pace of technological change and service innovation, and also why he believes CPIN's work in the digital space is so vital. But to kick off our conversation, I asked him about his CPIN standards journey.
It really started on the digital side of things back in 2008. At that time, I think CPIN as it is now was being established in BSI, and they were looking for some coordinators around particular themes, one of which was digital. And because I have a fairly decent set of experience before I retired in the digital world, and I'd had, I had people I'd worked with on standards issues before. I was quite keen to take that up, but there were very few people around at the time. There were perhaps a couple of us working on digital standards, and it's a field where there's an awful lot of work to do.
I think you're right, isn't it? It's one of those areas where, digital, we're undergoing digital transformation, and that incredible fast pace of technological change and sort of service innovation that we're all experiencing. I suppose, what are the challenges for standards development in dealing with that fast pace of change?
I need to go back to how the 20th century world worked for consumer protection standards, which was based on pretty much hardware products and safety, although a few other issues. And when you design a hardware product, you have production lines that are pretty much committed to that, producing that design. It comes off the end, it sells in volume, and it stays stable as a design for a considerable period of time, unless some major glitch is found, and then you get into a retrofit program. But the digital world's just not like that. You have digital functionality, and software comes into play. And the word soft is very significant. It means it's very easy to change. What that means is that people do significant functional upgrades of their products, perhaps a few times a year, as opposed to hardware products that hung around for years. With the hardware product, you can establish a standard that you test against, you release it to market, with an established level of protection, and that does the job. There are all sorts of costs involved in that. With software, you might test it to a certain standard when you launch, and then are you going to spend all that money again on retesting in 4 or 5 months' time, or maybe just 6 months' time? So there's a whole lot of other issues. I mean, the other thing to say about software is its quality levels are not the same as hardware. If you go digging around the internet for people who've actually researched software quality, you'll find that the fault rate per million lines of code is significant, in that there are glitches. They're not deliberate faults. They're not really design problems. It's really difficult to track down the accurate working of software in all the complex situations it has to operate in. So that's kind of the nature of the digital world.
Karen, no, go on, please.
No, you've broken my train of thought.
I just wondered, as a result of that, then, what are the challenges then for consumer representation in this space?
That's kind of why, when I started in 2008, I had to start thinking about what's our best strategy. We've got so few resources to address such a wide range of problems, and there are so many problems, and actually so few standards around current at that time addressing them. Can we find a limited set of things we can work on? And basically, we started with privacy. I was pretty lucky in that there was an EU project around that time. It was broadly 2010 to 2012, that was working on the privacy assessment of the radio frequency identification technology. This is your contactless payment cards or your key fobs for opening the car remotely and all that sort of thing. And we did a lot of good thinking about the basic issues of technological privacy then, which is kind of at the product level, because we were looking at the real issues of cars being stolen by using certain radio techniques to fool the car and that sort of thing. And, privacy is more than data protection. You've got to get quite deep into the security aspects of the design. And data protection really is about doing the right things after you've collected data from the consumer, but it doesn't really address, and in fact this is an explicit exclusion in the regulation, both UK and Europe, that it doesn't cover personal and household use. And yet that is exactly what a consumer product is. So yes, we actually that was a good opportunity for me to get really stuck into things and start thinking about them, and that led on to producing. So one of the key things that we did collectively, it was a joint exercise with myself between CPIN and ANEC in Europe, was we thought there's going to be a lot of new people who need the digital background. So we produced a set of consumer privacy guides that are still available on the ANEC site. I'm pleased to say, because they're fundamental. And they kind of go over a lot of the ground of what you're looking for in a product for it to be fit for purpose in terms of protecting your privacy. That work. So we're building up here. We're starting to lay some groundwork, but that still didn't address the problem of there are so many product types out there that are going digital. I've personally done some counting. It looks like there are something like 800 types of product that consumers use. Significant ones, not really niche ones. And I'm not talking individual products and brands here. I'm talking types of products. And at the moment, about 25% of them are digital or have gone digital. So there was no way we could address a whole range of standards on a product type by product type basis as the traditional world had done for safety standards. There are safety standards for babies' dummies and cooker hoods and things. There was just no way we could address that quickly and easily. So we kicked off work basically with support and request from Coll, which is the consumer arm of ISO. Basically did a lot of thinking, gap analysis, and we came out with a proposal for we should address standards that are about a product with digital functionality and its whole life cycle. Because every product has a life cycle. That's something that is actually common across all the product types. And that work started with privacy by design that we kicked off from the consumer arm of ISO, based on UK and European work. And that project is in train and should be delivering over the next year or two. So, yeah, fairly happy with that.
That's fascinating, Pete, there, what you said there about the sort of 25% of those 800 products. I mean, how long has that taken us to get to 25%? And I suppose the follow-up question is, for the 75%, how long do you think it would take us to get to sort of 100% of those products having a digital component?
I mean, it's based on things like government list of products that they use to calculate the CPI, the Consumer Prices Index. And you review that and you go, oh, they've missed things off like local government services. They're all consumed by products. And they frankly, because it's a prices index, they haven't counted in the digital services that are free, like Facebook and things like that. So you have to add to whatever the government is putting out at the moment. That's something we've been tracking from about the time I started as digital coordinator in 2008. And there was very little about that time. So we've gone from just a handful up to about 200 over that 15-year period. Well, a bit less than 15 years, but you get the rough time scale. And the other problem we've got is innovation. There are digitally based products around now that there was no equivalent before. It's not like making a fridge smarter. It's just something new and very different.
Actually, as a result of that, I mean, that must be a real challenge then for the consumer representation in standards development, because, like you say, it's not just a new version of an old product; it's something completely and utterly different. How does, what are the challenges there for consumer representation?
I mean, partly it's us deciding where we need to act and using various mechanisms to encourage BSI and others to produce the relevant standards, as we did with product lifecycle standard. And it's also being very careful about the standards that we work on. So I genuinely feel that work on a lifecycle standard, which happens to have started with privacy, but a bit outside the consumer CPIN context, but very much part of CPIN's consumer forum. Two members of that forum, the National Consumer Federation and the Electrical Safety First, have worked together on starting to lay down some principles for safe digital design of products. So a combination of a life cycle standard, some core principles for how the functionality needs to behave to be fit for purpose, and then gradually developing more detailed consumer guides in those areas to help people understand what they're looking for as specific requirements and individual standards. That's kind of where we are at the moment.
So, Pete, I'm just thinking, for all the things you've said here around such a fast pace of change in technology and the way that there's a digital element to lots and lots of consumer items now, I just wonder, how and why is CPIN important in this particular space?
Can I change the word important to vital?
Absolutely. How vital is CPIN in this space?
Okay. Let's start at the innovation end. One of the classic things you see with people who've been innovative is they think they're doing something new for the very first time. And what they don't realize is there are lessons learnt from those of us who might have been around a while. And there are basic things that need to be addressed or mistakes that need to be avoided. So often you find the consumer voice at the table is one of the ones with the widest view of the world, and what's going on in other areas. So that's kind of we tend to bring a certain amount of wisdom to the committees, particularly when it's all about new, bright, shiny stuff. At the practical level, what I've seen in actually participating in standards is that the consumer reps tend to reinforce the good guys around the table when they're putting sensible stuff forward. And it's not unusual for us to be putting forward, say, about 5% of the requirements. Sorry, I may count the numbers, guys, and I have actually done some analysis way back in time on the difference people have made. And that small number of extra things that we put in are actually because they're really important to consumers, and they wouldn't have been there if we hadn't been around the table. And we also help in terms of confirming what good looks like when, very sensible, good people from industry are putting them forward. In the digital world, I think that's even more essential because you've got much more of people saying, oh, this is bright, new and shiny, and it's all very different. And actually it isn't. There are lots of lessons that have been learnt, hard-won lessons over the years that people need to take into account, like dealing with vulnerable consumers, like avoiding unfair terms and conditions. It goes on.
My thanks to Liz Coll, Finn Myrstad, Martyn Allen and Pete Eisenegger for their contributions to this episode, and to you for listening. The next episode in this series is about consumers and services. To make sure you don't miss out, subscribe to the BSI Education Podcast now, wherever you get your podcasts.
You have been listening to an episode of the BSI Education Podcast. To find out more, visit bsigroup.com/education.
You just heard a Stripped Media production.